Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I am super honored to be having this question today. This discussion today. Take a moment and, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not, support us on Patreon if you have not. Click the link to order a copy of this book if you have not. It's an amazing text, and I look forward to discussing it today and discussing the life and theory and writing of Russell Maroon Shoatz. And, I'm honored to have the guests that we have today. We have Russell Shoatz III, Maroon's son, and then we have Hiram Rivera back on the show. And I'm just going to welcome them to the stage because, I want to spend as much time as we can getting into this discussion. So, gentlemen, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you, brother?
Good. Thank you for doing this. First of all, I just want to say it's like this is such an amazing book. And I think that everybody would be better for reading it. I was thinking about the discussion you had on Black Liberation Media with Jared Ball and Renee Johnston, and one of the things they both said is the way that Maroon challenged folks, right? And he's a very challenging thinker and challenging, orthodoxies and different ways of thinking and, evolving and changing throughout his life. And you really see that in the book. And you also get an amazing window that is not often the case in memoirs from revolutionaries from his generation of actual activities that he engaged in, including the escapes and the escape attempts, but also like the political education he was doing, up to the end of his life, and struggles against solitary confinement. And so there's so much. It's just a very rich text, and thank you for your part, and I know your siblings' part as well as Kanya for getting this book out.
Yeah, all I can say is thank you, and I'm really excited to be here with you and Hyrum because, as you said, my father does have a very specific style of work, even political work. His work is that what you're talking about. It's very analytical, it's very self-critical, and it's very critical of the movement and our works and how we go about it, down to very, kind of precise ways. The other thing that's very important about my father is that we all have kind of been through a process of political education throughout history in general. And what we've witnessed in that is what we spoke about a little bit off screen, is a weaponization of our terminology, of our movements through academia, and through a bunch of other media, Hollywood, all that type of stuff too. And we could talk about that. But my father, nothing like Malcolm, but very close in the context of making things very understandable to people who are not, academia, who don't have PhDs, who haven't went to college, and those people are very important in these movements. And my father made complaints about specific organizations that had approached him historically about organizing and targeted, which is not a bad thing, just unbalanced, as he mentioned, targeted college students and academia over street soldiers and people without that level of education. And that is a very bad move that we have made historically and we continue to make today. I'm sorry, run it. Go ahead.
No, I think that's a great point, and it'll touch on some of the themes I know we're going to get into this discussion. Do you want to say a couple words on why you wanted Hyrum to join us on this conversation? I'm obviously honored to have Hyrum again.
I'm glad you said it's quite a few things. It's too many probably to name here. Probably the most important one is what I just said. Hyrum is probably the closest comrade that I have, that I've seen do Maroon style work ideologically. Long before any of this, long before any of y'all knew him, we would sit in my print shop and me and Quan's print shop and do what we're talking about. And we just hear Hyrum and all of his fucking shit. We would just hear Hyrum all night. And he'd be practicing on us. We'd be up against the ropes and he'd be boom, boom, uppercut, and we would just, be his sparring partners, which there is no sparring partner really. But ideologically, a place for him to come and tune in and relax, but also we would go out and do the street stuff too. It wouldn't just be Hyrum, this intellectual dude who would come. No, he would go and do street stuff. And I remember specifically during, and I should have gave you this link to pull up, during the uprisings, I was speaking at Malcolm X Park, and I was trying to make the point of how important it was at that most critical moment that we don't forget, lose, or not negotiate properly. So forget what we have gotten or what we have done to get the state to this point, our movements and all the work we have done, what we need to be asking for when we get the state to a most excellent point. And one of the things I was saying is we need to be asking for our political prisoners, not to defund the police. But I looked around, scanned the whole audience, because it was 500 people in the park, 500 white people in a park that generally wasn't. I'm scared in the park to see who I can get to resonate with me around the fact that I was running them down. Palestine don't leave their political prisoners. Ireland don't leave their political prisoners. Puerto Rico for sure. And I looked around, I saw Hyrum, and I said, Hyrum. I didn't say Hyrum. I said, does anybody understand what? And Hyrum screamed out, yes, yeah, brother. And I looked and I said, yeah, Hyrum does understand exactly. I know Hyrum knows what I'm talking about. And he voiced that in that moment, and so, yes.
That's great. Hyrum, do you want to say some initial remarks just on the subject, on the book,
Yeah, no, I think definitely humbled by Russell's request to be on here. I think the book was an incredible insight into Maroon's life, into Maroon's thinking. It's a good follow-up to Maroon's first book, right? Maroon the Impactful. So you get more of who Maroon was in his personal, that I think also had a tremendous influence and a tremendous role in shaping his politics and his actions and all of that. And those two things living together, even if at times they contradicted each other, right? And it was a rough balancing for him. And so really excited to talk about the book and be here with Russ. And again, right, humbled by Russ's words, but also very appreciative of the space that Russell created and has always created for this type of work, right? And so Russell himself engages in that same type of Maroon organizing, Maroon educating and learning, right? The switching of the roles from teacher and student, right, simultaneously, and creating those spaces for everyone to be able to do that, be it through the print shop, which was super fun in a very just kind of low key and informal way, to all the different events that Russ has put on through the curb fests and all different things that he's been a part of. So really excited to jump into it.
That's great. Why don't we start, Russell, with one of your questions, which is, you had this question about, the sort of abuse that exists within the book. And I mean, one of the interesting things about this book that I learned is that, it started as a family document.
Yeah.
And that obviously this gets into the really kind of deeply self-critical aspect of your father, because he's able to look back at these stories, share them, from his perspective, but be very self-critical and also talk about his own evolution around these issues, and draw political points out of that he feels are much broader in terms of his critique of patriarchy. As I think at one point he says in the book that he sees it as like the dominant form of oppression in the world. And and you know, I'm curious, like, you know, I know that this had to be difficult, you know, also for your family, you know, to deal with at certain levels, and also you all remain very dedicated. At least you and your sisters remain very dedicated to his freedom and maintained a connection. Um, and he shared this with you all and was also critical around it. And I know that that was hard. I'm thinking about the interview again with Jared and Renee over on Black Liberation Media. Um, and your sister, I think Sharon, talking about you know, the difficulty that she had, kind of, that she didn't want to talk to your father for a year, you know, the first time that she
Yep.
sort of read all of this.
Yep.
But, you know, what does that mean to you, you know, as a, from a family perspective, but also from a political perspective, in terms of how he addressed and, you know, shared so much of this?
Yeah, it was just a lot, and and obviously the male female dynamic. I'm a lot more in touch with my divine feminine, which allows me to lean into it a certain type of way, but never in the way of the women, you know, in this story. And there's so many women, and so yes, my sisters were affected in a way different way than I was, you know, and even still to today. It's an interesting way that I dealt with it, because me and my sister were both talking about that we haven't grieved in a traditional way. And I don't think I ever will. And I think she hasn't for other reasons. Some of those reasons she named, you know, some of it still dealing with things. When she reads passages from the book, her voice starts to crack, and I could feel, you know, tears about to come, but you know, it just hasn't come yet or whatever. But you know, I encourage and push her to allow that to happen. Me myself, it was interesting. I had a spiritual awakening maybe a year, 6 months prior to my father being released, which gave me a different insight on mortality and death. And I got some downloads on that. And one of my big hashtags now is just contemplate your mortality. You know, and that's something that our PPs always had to do. And when my father came home, had to do it at another level. You know, if you fighting the state the way he fighting it, then you're going to contemplate, you're going to think about death. You're going to think about death all the time, or at least enough to be able to sit with it and be like, okay, it's a real thing. It's going to happen. It may happen tonight, you know, that type of thing. And so just embracing that, but also people were calling me and being like, oh, condolences, I'm sorry, Maroon, about, and I was like, I spent literally my life trying to liberate this man, not just through the conventional ways. I put together cells to try to break him out of prison. So it was a lot of work, emotional labor, physical labor, financial labor, all of that, right? So when I got him out and he was free and everybody was running to see him and all this, I like turned and walked the opposite direction. It's like, Pops, if you need anything, I'll let you, nigga. But other than that, we Gucci. And, you know, whatever struggles internally we were going through and whatever, most of those struggles, because he came out, I was like, yeah, you, I was like, bro, what? Like, you home. Like, yeah. And them things I was telling you about, JPay and all that, we beefing about and all of that. Bro, I don't care about none of that. I won. So we not ideologically going around about Islam or nothing else, period, ever again in your life. Why? Because you home. And that was my goal. Get you home. I won. You gotta let all these other people, all 150 grandkids and other shooters that never met you and haven't been up to the prison, let them come and see you now. You know, but other than that, you know, I was just really overwhelmed, you know, to have them home. And I saw it as a celebration, and I'm still celebrating. You know what I mean? It's a celebration of a freedom fighter. His transition is a celebration of freedom fighting. And if you can't get none of that, then you probably missed some of Maroon. You know, if you don't celebrate him as the freedom fighter and it's just all woe is me, then you might have missed a little bit. And you know, but me personally, I'm just celebrating because I had enough woes with him. You know, I had enough crying days and all that. Had enough grief. The grief is, you know what I mean? Now I'm like, we did that shit. We actually did that shit. And I actually have a rubric. I have a way. I have an understanding of how to do it. I know the best practices and what not to do. And we'll talk about that.
No, that's great. Yeah, Hiram, did you want to?
Yeah,
There was a
no,
part of that.
that's
There was a part of that, Russell, that you wanted to ask Hiram. What around the abuse and the movement, individual terms? Was there a specific
Oh,
question that
yes.
you wanted to get at?
Yes. But go ahead, Hiram. I got mine. You were about to say
Yeah.
something. Go ahead, Hiram, quick.
no, real quick. I was just gonna say what you just said, Russ, is extremely powerful because for those of us who have been a part of political prisoner campaigns, and for those of us who've gotten a lot of inspiration from our political prisoners, we isolate them, we romanticize them, we pedestalize them, we isolate them, we deify them, right? And we don't ever. A lot of times we don't have the access to family or know who family members are. A lot of the family members aren't around sometimes. They're just kind of like doing their own thing, or just off to the side. You may have one or two family members who are represented inside of their campaigns, but very rarely do you think of the family members. And oftentimes when you do think of them, you just assume that they are extensions of them, and you assume that, yeah, they're all just like them, especially their children. And what I found was that, nah, there's a lot of pain that comes with being the family member, the child of the partner of a political prisoner. There's an incredible amount of sacrifice that was made, right? And in turn, and speaking to former political prisoners from different groups, from New Africans to Puerto Ricans and stuff, right? That there was a conscious decision made to sacrifice the family for the sake of the cause, the struggle, the movement, the people, right? And that leaves, on one end, a lot of times for those family members I've had the fortune of speaking to, especially the children of Nahanda Abiadun, right, of Dilcia Pagan, of these different folks who there was a lot of resentment towards their parent for leaving them. I grew up alone, or I had to grow up with somebody else. You weren't there for my prom. You weren't there for my graduation. You weren't there when I had my first kiss or I had a question about sex. You weren't there for, right, these things that really made me. And I always had to live in the shadow of you and the pressure of trying to live, or people expecting me to be the second coming of you. And this distancing and just shunning a lot of times of movement and of the work, and then eventually coming back in adulthood, right, to fully understanding the sacrifice that their parents made. And so in a little bit that Russell shared there, and even the sake of like, my dad's home, I'm gonna go walk this way now, which I saw, right? We saw, is heavy because I never asked Russ about that. And I never, you know what I'm saying? Never, again, you don't go back to checking in with Russ and be like, what was that like? I'm reading about little Russell in the book, right? And it's just like, wow. And reading about his dad and the family dynamics. And I'm just like, yo, that's a lot for a little kid, yo. Like, that's a lot for a little kid. And talking about 10-year-old Russ in a courtroom and stuff, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's a lot. And so I just thank you for sharing that, because oftentimes we don't understand the very personal dynamics that exist inside of this political prison thing, and just how it affects so many people. And so thanks for sharing that, Russ, because that was I think there could be a whole show on just that.
No. So I'm working on some writings and some interviews, just of like, all of the children that you spoke of. And, a lot of times, we get this Panther Cub thing, and I'm like, that's cute. I'm not really a Cub, anymore. At least I might have been a Cub at some point. Right. I'm not, I'm about to rip something up. I'm not, scratching and drinking some milk or whatever. But also they're just children of struggle, in general, folks from Puerto Rico, Yuri Kochiami's, children, Mexican folks, and I'll take this moment to shout out the Rosenberg Fund, who has, put, funds together for children of political prisoners for years, and so, and all of them, across the board, red diaper babies, Weathermen children, and I'm going around and collecting their stories. And so at some point it'll be in some format.
Yeah, thank you for that work as well. So what did you want to ask Hyrum about the sort of movement and individual, kind of abuse question? Let's get into that.
Yeah. And so, just analytically, what I'm experiencing, and you guys chime in on it, is a certain level of abuse movement wise, and a lot of times it just looks like exploitation, capitalist exploitation. The most kind of jarring one that we've been experiencing that I see happening a lot is when movement people pass away, political prisoners or whatever, you'll see GoFundMe pages pop up, immediately. And you'll see, even in the process, before they pass away, you'll see that happen, or you'll see other social media platforms pop up, and people asking for money or fundraising or what have you. But just abuse of people internally in the movement, even just on a lower level, just comrade to comrade, person to person. The movement has kind of had a history of abuse all the way back to civil rights, and I like to take Malcolm and others and say, we're bathed in blood here in America. America is violent. We come through a violent experience with this country. And so violence is a very much part of the culture. Violence is a very much part of American culture in general. And so that is also, we tried to dance around it and make it like it's not, but our movement culture has been very violent internally, all the way from stuff like Sam Napier and folks torturing him in the basement and one of our greatest revolutionary producers of the Panther paper, and other folks, and other movements who have been tortured, killed, maimed, abused physically, mentally, otherwise. The women, the sisters, how they've been abused, used, sexually exploited, other things, mentally exploitation that's going on, internally in the movement. It's very dysfunctional, very unhealthy. And so I want to name that, part of my analyzation on it is basically, again, we come from, a violent type situation. We come from abusive type situation, and in a phenon way, in a way that we recognize we are using their tools. And until we create new tools of our own, until we're able to use our own pedagogy to develop, or we use our own teachings, we use our own studies, our own ways of living every day, and we take those ways of living every day and put them into a structure that works for us, not what the state structure has given us, not what the Western ideology has given us. And some of that comes down to abuse of power, specifically in things like ratchet rules and how we run a meeting and how we set an agenda. And if you're unfamiliar with any of that, you can be abused and manipulated thoroughly in that way. And so I just wanted to touch on that. If you guys could please.
You start off, Hyrum, and then I'll add some thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. There's different types of violence that has been expressed in terms of movements historically. That's looked like a couple of different ways. On one end, there's romanticized Fanonian version of violence, right? Of finding your humanity in that, as the colonized, right? Violently rising up against your colonizer and finding your humanity, finding yourself inside of that struggle. I think oftentimes gets romanticized, and definitely was romanticized heavy during the movements of like the 60s and the 70s. And then when you add the violence of the state through its COINTELPRO, the state enacts violence in many ways, right? It's the violence of bankrupt schools. It's the violence of unaffordable housing. It's the violence of unaffordable healthcare, right? All the different ways that violence manifests itself at the hands of the state. But at that time, specifically, their COINTELPRO, their literal violence, the psychological warfare that was being enacted on those inside of the walls, behind the walls, and those out in the streets, led to distorted understandings of discipline, especially when folks, and your Maroon criticizes the role of the Vanguard Party, criticizes heavily the role of Marxist organization, right? But the discipline that was necessary inside of those organizations, the centralization, the discipline, and then when the COINTELPRO was coming in disrupting that, the fratricidal violence that was enacted on each other, right? Claiming who was
What
a
is
Fed, who
fratricidal?
was a
What's
Fed.
fratricidal?
Fratricidal is brother killing brother, right? And so your comrades, those the folks who you grew up with, you join this organization, and all of a sudden there's letters, there's things, you're being presented with so-called proof that says that your brother is turning on you, he's a Fed, and next thing you know, you're tying people up in basements, you're pouring boiling water on them, you're torturing them, right? The same thing happened to Alex Rackley in New Haven, right? Which ended up getting Bobby Seale arrested in the whole Free Bobby campaign in 1970 in New Haven. And you saw that across the board. You saw it with the Young Lords, right? And the torturing of Richie Perez. Richie Perez, the legendary Richie Perez, wrote about this specifically, the torture that the Young Lords started to enact on each other, ultimately destroyed these organizations, right? But comes from that manipulation from the state. But again, you have these legacies of abuse. You know, Maroon in his book talks a lot about the different types of abuse and violence he faced as a young person, be it gang violence, a certain type of, you know, violence that came in the way of, in his articulation, the lack of love from his mother, or an intentional like lack of displaying love towards him that shaped him in a lot of ways. That then people just carry that into their spaces. We are not immune to violence. We're not immune to the consequences of capitalism. So there is no perfect organization, be they centralized like a political party or affinity groups or whatever, that is not corrupted by violence. A lot of times, unfortunately, we see it manifested through sexual violence, sexual assault of women and partners in our organizations, in our struggles, in our spaces, verbal abuse, ableist abuse, all kinds of different abuse, because we carry those contradictions of capitalism with us. The problem is we don't know how to address those. Oftentimes we just know how to address them with more violence, right? The violence of excluding people, the violence of turning people away, the violence of hopping on social media and just talking, you know, shit posting 24/7. Everyone stay away from this group. Everyone stay away from that person. And before you know it, you have a list of 40 people who you're shit posting about, right? And that's just your job.
All you got is 40?
Man,
I got 140. No, I'm only joking.
Here in Philadelphia, they have lists of hundreds of people, right? But that violence is learned, and it's continuously manifested, unless it is like we stop, we look at it, we uproot it, we struggle through it, we struggle with the people, right, who are perpetuating violence. And again, there's different levels of who you struggle with, who you choose to struggle with, and who just needs to be shunned and tossed away, right? But to wrap up with this, I think that it is something that we need to take account for. We need to learn as movements, as organizations, to be comfortable with hitting the pause button. The work is always going to be there. The struggle is always going to be there. We need to sometimes hit the pause button, reassess, look at what is happening, and deal with some of the internal things that need to be dealt with before we can move forward, or else we just keep replicating the same behaviors, the same learned behaviors, right? That Russ you're talking about, even in the forms of how we structure meetings sometimes. And if people don't have, and Russ did a great example of that, what's fratricide? Pause for a second, explain this. If we don't explain to the folks why certain things are the way they are, or why we need to do them a certain way that we do, then you're going to unintentionally harm people who are walking into space and not having a clear understanding of why this is, or why they're showing up, even in the meeting, the way we structure our meetings. But Jared, you're gonna say something.
No, thank you for that. You know, I know this is a quote that has been read a lot, and it stands out in the introduction and the piece that Kanya wrote, really putting herself into the dialogues that she had with your father over years, you know, as you know, she worked with this family document and also interviewed him extensively to try to get as much of the information out of him, his perspective, and so on. And there's this real struggle she has with him around violence, this real struggle that she has of like, I don't understand, you know, and part of it is also this, that he sees the Tamil Tigers, that he sees the liberation movements in Sri Lanka.
Who are the Tamil Tigers? Give a little, just a quick one.
I don't know that history that well. Do
Oh, okay,
you,
okay,
Hyrum?
okay.
I know. Yeah.
The
Go
Tamil
ahead,
Tigers
go ahead,
were the Tamil Tigers were identified themselves as a revolutionary organization that was trying to bring about, in their articulation, a Marxist revolution in Sri Lanka against the government, and they utilized violence. A lot of these groups are like Maoist organizations, right? The Panthers were Maoists. In the book, Maroon refers to the Revolutionary Action Movement, who were Maoists, right? And so for a lot of these Maoist groups, it is the emphasis on the peasant revolt and the use of violence. And so they had suicide bombers. They had the Black Tigers, who were female suicide bombers. They committed a lot of violence on the state and on the people of Sri Lanka. I think you could equate them something to like Sendero Luminoso, the shining path in Peru, right? And so that's who they were.
Yeah.
And so go ahead. I have my thought. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Do you have your thought, Jared?
Oh, I just wanted to read the quote of what he said
good.
back to her.
So before the quote, a good little intersection there, now that Hyrum gave the breakdown, is that because she's from that region, and my dad, the way he is, like, I still have Dalek newspapers and all this stuff that I would have to give to my dad and send to him, whatever. But I was well studied in, Indian culture and Sri Lankan culture in the context of revolutionaries. And I knew about the Tamil Tigers, and I knew they had female women that were vicious, like just vicious, right? And so I know just from who my dad is and how he does that she felt pressure to be a Tamil Tiger. Whether and I know he never even, but because he saw them at the highest level, at the highest ranking, these women soldiers, he's like, oh, the women over there, they done contemplated their mortality. They're using life as a tool of liberation. Their whole life is just a tool. They about to, like a hammer. I'm a big hammer. I got the dynamite strapped to me. It looked like I'm pregnant, but I'm about to come and get busy, which I will say ties to an ideology in a lot of people are big fans of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. I love her work. I think the forerunner to her work, or Neely Fuller's compensatory code, talks about violence in that context and talks about if you're going to use violence like the state uses violence, right? We should be saying that we don't support that. We don't support state violence. We don't support how they go and just kill indiscriminately random people. You sleeping in your bed and a bomb drop and kill millions of people. There's nothing principled or humane about that. And so if you do any of that in retaliation, you're not principled either. The only principled way of having violence in that way is if you say, oh, I'm going to take out these people or whatever. The first thing you need to contemplate is taking out yourself with them. If they going, you need to go with them. If you feel that adamant about taking lives, because taking lives is not just, we know from people taking lives, all the way from police to military to prison guards, it actually has a worse effect on you. You took the life, but you're going to live with that. And people who have taken lives, we know the stories. You can't sleep at night. Some people are meant to take lives. Some people are just life takers. They can sleep at night. The other 8 out of the 10 of us who aren't that will have major problems with taking people's lives.
Yeah, and I want to say too that the violence that is being discussed, and even when we're talking about the Tamil Tigers or whatever, right, is tied to our understandings of power. Be it in the meeting space, be it in a revolutionary organization, violence is always tied to our understanding of power, right, and the desire for it, how to achieve it, how to wield it, right. So Huey Newton defined power as being able to define phenomena and wielding it in a desired manner. Naming, being able, the ability to name your condition and being able to do something about it, right? Change those situations, change those conditions. And I think when we're talking about violence, we have to talk about this notion of power, because those two things are tied to each other. And folks' desire to wield it, folks' understanding of it, folks' wanting to not live under someone else's power, or what you feel you need to, especially when we're talking about the state, and especially when we're talking about the bourgeois state, especially if we're talking about white folks who only understand power one way, through violence. And so then there is this idea that in order to break out of hell, you're going to have to walk through hell, right? You're going to have to consciously walk through hell to get out of it. And there are those, to Russ's point that he's just making, there are those who sign up and be like, I will do that for us. I'm prepared. I'm prepared, right? I'm prepared to go do that. And in hell, right? When in Rome, do as the Romans, right? Because it's the only language that they understand. The problem is that when you internalize, again, to my point before, we internalize these things through institutions, through movies, through culture, through their schools, through their newspapers. We internalize all of these capitalist and bourgeois teachings that then
could you give a quick definition of bourgeois?
Bourgeois is the ruling class. Bourgeois are the folks who sit at the top. Your billionaires, your trillionaires, they're the ruling class.
Are they only white?
They own all the factories. They own the resources. They own everything that we need to survive and live. They use that to make a profit for themselves at our expense.
Is it only Europeans, or can Africans be bourgeois also?
Bourgeois has no race to it. The bourgeois has no race to it. But in this context, in this country here, the majority are European. The majority are European. And even on the continent, to an extent, right? There's different levels within that class, where the European still sits at top as a result of European colonialism and violence that goes all the way back when those devils came on ships. And so, because we are molded in this society, then our concept of power is also shaped and molded by that understanding of what that means, and that the only way to get through it is to do as the Romans. And Maroon, in his book, talks again about the Revolutionary Action Movement, and I bring him up again because of Philadelphia, right? And the immortal Dr. Muhammad Ahmed, Max Stanford, right? And his Revolutionary Action Movement. Maroon talks about their call for a Black cultural revolution, in the spirit of the Chinese Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao, because RAM was a Maoist organization, a Black cultural revolution, where Maroon talks about that, according to RAM, folks had to lose their Negro mind. This Negro mind that was tied heavily to the U.S., that was tied heavy to the notions of U.S. society. Put yourself up by your bootstrap. Make sure you everything's right in order, do things the right way, sort of thing. That all it did was just subjugate Black people during that time period and kept them in their place. And that there had to be a break with that, and to get back to Black people's true culture, not in a cultural nationalist sense, but your true culture as African people, to then lose that that U.S. way of thinking and replace it with an African mind that would understand each other differently, that would understand our relationships to each other differently, that would understand our relationship to the planet differently. And by default, then, we would understand power and violence and the need for it when and where very differently, when it's not molded and shaped by our colonizers and our enslavers.
Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just read the quote from Maroon, right? And so this again, which is a lot of what is basically what Hyrum just said, but again, he's responding to Kanya, who has, because of her own experiences, partly in Sri Lanka, and because of seeing the level of violence, that she's very resistant to how much of Maroon's story is it includes different kinds of violence, including ones that he engaged in himself, right? And he says to her, quote, "You still don't get it, do you? Violence wasn't a solution. No one said it was a solution. It was a language. It was the language, the one America taught us to speak, the only language that America understands. We are not the victims of America's violence. We are her children." And so again, like this, back to also the point you talked about earlier, Russell, with regard to, violence and abuse within movement spaces too. Movements are not outside of the society that we come out of, right? And so we, when you see, and I think that's one of the important things about your father talking about his own upbringing, his own history, his own intercommunal violence and things like that, violence within his community, growing up, that, he's sharing, this is how I came to this, right? And, this is the context that I came out of to go into these types of movements, right? And so, yeah, I brought it with me, and I used it because those were the skills that I mean, that's also the other way he talks about it too, is in terms of learning how to fight, in terms of learning how to best people in fist fights, and then, he talks about his time at the steel mill and like building up his strength and all of these things, right? And so, there is a certain level of that, yeah, we are who we are when we come into these spaces. And I think that's the challenge too that Hiram's talking about, right? Of like, we have to have practices within our movements that defend people against the violence that can be enacted within our groups, right? And we have to work really hard to develop those practices to make sure that they instill a level of discipline, but also a level of care and a level of, ensuring that we can root abuse out of the movements. But you also have to have that flexibility of, you don't want to just throw people away because they come to these spaces, broken in some ways, or like, full of a rough life that brought them to where they are, where they're ready to fight too. And I think that's one of the difficult balances that we have within movements, right? Is that on one level, we need as many Russell Maroon Shoatzes as we could possibly, like, we could never have enough, right? On some level. But also, how do you set up the structures within the organization to ensure that kind of energy gets directed in the right direction and in the right ways? And that's a very challenging task, I think,
Yeah.
so, you know,
And that speaks
um,
that speaks to the piece real quick, Jared, in the
yeah, go
book
ahead.
when he's talking about the kilombos,
Yes.
right? And when Maroon shifts from the underground violence, because he goes through that process and he's reflecting and he's analyzing the role of what's necessary to bring about revolution and types of revolution, right? And the debates that he had with the sisters inside of the Black Unity Council. And he talks about the patriarchy, the machismo, right? Of not listening to sisters who were kind of like, maybe we shouldn't embark on those specifically violent actions or those sorts of things right now because we've got this other stuff, and they kind of like shun them for that. Um, but in the quilombos, those spaces, the space that you're talking about that he created inside of the prison, behind the walls, once he graduated to the level of old head, right? And he talks about there's these different levels and these different rankings that he goes to from peewee all the way up
Right.
to old head. And when he becomes the old head, um, he creates those liberatory spaces where they're doing study groups, where they're debating things from the IRA to the Vietnam War to all these different revolutionary movements with folks who are incarcerated for a number of different reasons. And he talks about even folks who some of them didn't know how to read. And so they had to figure out, how do you take these deeply analytical and political things, put them in context that folks can understand, and allow them to engage in those conversations. What I learned from working with young people, for so many years, was that one of the most horrible things that ever happened was that folks never asked them questions about what was happening in the world and in their life. So when we talk about elections, we talk about policies, we talk about these different things, the young people were saying, no one ever asked my opinion on this stuff. And they have plenty of opinions on things like elections, the government policies and stuff like that. The same thing is with folks who may be deemed as too dumb to understand, or prisoners, or that sort of thing, right? Never allowing the space to have them chime in and have them put their brilliance in there. And so, to your point, right, Maroon recognized that and creates those quilombos behind the walls, which has an incredible impact as he talks about the mentees, right? That have come, and all those folks who Maroon has menteed as a result of creating space for people who school, society, the prison itself said, you don't deserve to have 2 cents on this. You don't deserve to have an opinion, right? You probably don't even have one. Um,
We should say too what a quilombo is. I mean, because
Oh, thank you.
again, this is another term that
Thank you.
folks may not know, and so, I mean, it comes from a history of maroon colonies, right? So a history of enslaved people escaping, going back, getting their friends, their family members, helping them escape, right, and creating a space that is kind of a semi-liberated zone. And there's a very interesting one of the things that Maroon distinction that he made that I think is very interesting and important is the distinction he makes between a treaty Maroon, which is a group of formerly enslaved African people who come into some agreement with their former colonizers in order to maintain some kind of space. And often it included returning enslaved people if they
Mhm.
came or things like this, almost kind of a border system and a kind of, the way we might think of nation states having agreements around immigration and things like this. Um, to another form, which was the sort of fighting maroon, as he would call it, like the one who maintained their distinction by saying, "No, we're going to fight you off if you come to us," right? And he really very much appreciated that second legacy of the fighting maroon, the one that maintains its liberation and its distance from the colonizers by defending itself and its territory from them. Um, and the Quilombo, I want to say a little bit about this because, there's a lot of resonances. I don't know if you have read Orasami Burton's book, The Tip of the Spear,
That
Russell, but
John, that John, that John
yeah,
is fire. I
it's
gotta get
really
that.
great.
That John is fire.
It's really great, but there's a lot of resonances in this chapter. I mean, in this book. I mean, even both of them have a chapter that's some version of the war on the mind. I think in Orasami it's the war on the revolutionary
Yep.
mind, and then in this book, it's war on the mind. But this point around the Quilombo is something that kind of connects because one of Orasami Burton, the author of that book's arguments, is that one, the proliferation of prisons and of control units and of really heightened solitary confinement was a response to Black revolutionary activity, and that it was a way of, you had to build more prisons and more of these tighter control units in order to get people like your father away from the imprisoned populations because they were such potent, and this is the second point, radical educators, right? That they could actually teach whole groups of prisoners about radical history, about their own histories, about, your father was so amazing in terms of the way that he also approached solidarity on an international level, teaching a lot of Black and brown prisoners who probably had very negative relationships with Irish Americans growing up, as he talks about it, like about the IRA, and he talks about this. Um, and so, but that point of the Quilombo is that, again, like part of your father's then extreme isolation, which he went through for 20 years. I mean, one, there's the kind of point made that this may have been developed, with the direct purpose of your father, of actually
Yep.
isolating him more than anyone else,
Yeah.
at least in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also this point about, breaking up what Orasami Burton talks about as prisons as universities for revolutionaries, which is also, I think, something that Lenin even talked about way back in the day. So I thought that was a really potent kind of aspect in the book where you see some of these things that Orasami Burton is talking about from the first person perspective of your father, someone who lived it and went through all of these different phases, being inside through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, up until just a couple years ago. So, yeah,
No, I
I don't know
mean,
if you have reflections, but yeah.
yeah, I read it and it's it's super powerful. He's on point. I love a lot of his dot connecting and analysis. And yeah, I haven't seen that level of analysis specifically in the context that you speak, but also in the context. What one thing I really like where he touches on is, and this intersects the terminology conversation we were having earlier, and he breaks down the experiences in Attica. He uses Attica specifically in that uprising, and talking about abolition and how we have this, I guess, kind of rose glass approach to abolition, and most abolitionists can't tell you what it actually would look like or should look like, or they don't have ideology, they don't have structure, they don't have apparatus that's set up in in real time right now. No apparatus set up right now that can facilitate their ideas. Or no ways of gauging those who are returning citizens, returning neighbors, folks who have been incarcerated. So when they come back into the system, how to integrate them into the system. So if you don't have that, how are you talking about abolition? How are you going to do abolition when we can't even do returning properly? If that makes any sense?
Yeah, it does. I know Hyrum has things he can say about this too.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, Maroon talks about, there's a quote where he's talking to another prisoner, and they're reflecting on the differences that they saw. They don't articulate in the same way that Orsanmi does in the book, but what happened when the prison stopped becoming a university and was intentionally transformed into something else through prison reforms, right? Specifically through prison reforms. Orsanmi talks about reforms and like the new Jim Crow stuff and all that, but the influx of programs into the prison to remove or basically break up those kilombos, break up those spaces where you had folks like Maroon, you had folks like Daruba bin Wahad, Jalil Muntakim, right? All of these prisoners who were being taken off the streets, and what the state thought was warehousing them and throwing them away behind these walls, but we're actually putting them in spaces with folks who had nothing left to lose. All they had was everything to win. And so they were educating, right, and politicizing what George Jackson says, the book Behind You, Blood in My Eye, right, transforming the criminal mentality into a revolutionary mentality. A lot of what Maroon was talking about, and what Dr. Ahmed, right, in transforming the Negro mind. In transforming that, Maroon in the book talks about through this thing where the difference between the 70s and the 80s. He said we had study groups, but then they started putting TVs inside of the prisons, and they were watching TV and they weren't studying anymore. That we used to have discipline, but now we have this. We used to have X, but now we have Y. Even so much as these kids listen to all this rap music, right? Which I thought was funny, but it's talking about them behind the walls, seeing this transformation happening in real time, and the real significant impact that is happening on the prisoners and their ability and inability to then organize those younger folks and organize them, and what it meant, not just for them behind the walls, but then also outside in society. Orsami's book does a great job of highlighting that and raising the contradictions of abolition, right? And these notions of abolition, because Maroon doesn't talk about abolition. He doesn't mention abolition, but his struggle is abolitionist, right? Maroon's whole being is about being free. Maroon was always free and talks about himself as being free, even when he was behind the walls. And there's this deep embodiment of that particular type of Maroonage, right? All the way to the amazing stories of his escapes, how he escaped, what that was like being an escape, even tips and like, don't do this next time, do that instead, right? I mean, fascinating, because you don't hear those details from former political prisoners unless you have a deep relationship with them. And even then, you still don't get the details of how they did what they did. And if you're around them enough, you don't ask questions. You just hope that one day they start storytelling and you learn some stuff. But Maroon does say how, right? Step by step how, which is fascinating. The abolition piece, to Russ's point, is, I mean, it starts to miss the mark, and we're seeing this transformation again of where abolition is now allowed to be spoken about freely. It's propagated. There's a new abolition book every other week. They all basically say the same thing, right? But what it has become is a virtue signal. abolition doesn't mean anything, in my opinion. Abolition doesn't mean, so you call yourself an abolitionist, doesn't mean anything. It is a replacement for having an actual politic and actual ideology, which is why most of the folks who are propped up as the primary abolitionists and the most famous abolitionists don't have an actual politic. It's an eclectic mix of quasi-anarcho, sometimes, Marxy, mix jab thing, and then they'll come and tell you to go vote Kamala Harris because it doesn't mean anything. For the folks like George Jackson, for the folks that Orsami is talking about, their notions of abolition was directly tied to the total transformation of this state, the total recreation of the world itself. It wasn't just about tearing down these structures or creating, ending mass incarceration. It was about the world that they wanted to live in. And not just they want to live in, but they wanted all of us to live in. And Maroon, in his way, is talking about that world as well, where he's calling on folks to be free, dare to be free, whatever that looks like, however it has to come, dare to be free. Don't let them strip you of that imagination. Abolition is the way it's constructed now. Like I said, it's just a virtue signal. It's a place marker for folks who don't want to have the responsibility of standing 10 toes down on an ideology. You want to hold on to your rad lib sort of progressiveness. You want to hold on to your nonprofit jobs. You want to have cool little books and quirky things that AK Press and Haymarket will sell you, right? That don't say shit, you know what I'm saying? But they make a lot of money. And so to wrap it up, I think the lessons that we learned from Maroon, the lessons that we learned from George, the lessons that we learned from Orsami's book, right, is the importance of having a grounded politics, that you can understand the conditions that you're in. You understand the moments historically, materially, economically, all those forces, but that you also don't lose your imagination within that. And you're able to envision something that is concrete, that is real, that we can attain in real time. It's going to take discipline, right? Where is it? Maroon talks about in the book that why he joined the Black Panthers, why the Black Unity Council that he was a part of joined the Black Panthers, why so many folks in the Black community joined the Black Panther Party was because they had a clear vision for the future. It was a clear vision of the future that they could articulate to the people and tell the people, here's how we're going to get to that future, which is what made them the most dangerous organization in the United States at that time, because it was clear. Their understanding of the conditions, their understanding of what the future could be, and their understanding and their articulation of how we can get there was so clear that the state just jumped on it. And abolitionists right now, abolitionism, or how we want to frame it through the nonprofit, is primarily coming through the nonprofit industrial complex. And you can refer back to that 8-hour talk you and I had on that, right? Is sold as just a hodgepodge of nothingness that is just there to sell books. It's there to platform a specific demographic of folks, and keep us locked in this whirlwind of eclectic nonsense that gets us nowhere and ultimately doesn't have an impact on the community itself. Because to when these abolitionists hopped on our Instagram pages, reels, and YouTube shows and all that, telling us to go vote for Kamala, the vast majority of folks just sat the election out. There is no connection to the working class anymore. The Democratic Party doesn't have one. These so-called abolitionists don't have one. Our so-called Black, mass nonprofit organizations don't have the hearts and minds of everyday people anymore. And that was glaring in this last election. And as part of the lessons that Maroon, that George, that Orsami, that Jalil, that Daruba talk about, that was where it came from. That's where the vision, the struggle, the people, it came from the people, being in the neighborhoods with the people, talking with the people, engaging through kilombos, through whatever, right? In that process to articulate and carve out the way forward. And this is what Maroon is talking about when he talks about Maroonage and the Maroons and the Maroon societies.
One thing I want to just throw in real quick is quilombo, I believe, is a Brazilian word, and it's actually spelled like with a QU for anyone who's trying to look that up. But also, there's an excellent, I won't call it a slave revolt movie called Quilombo from South America. It's so incredible. It has subtitles, but it's worth anyone's look at, a slave revolt movie. It's like, it's bananas, but Quilombo, QU.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think an interesting thing within the text, and you brought this up a little bit earlier, Russell, is your father lived from a period in which the way that people related to prisoners of war, and your father, he was a prisoner of war, not just a political prisoner. Um, I mean, he was both, but the um, the way that they related to them was, I mean, one, your father took it as a responsibility of himself to try to free himself, right? That was like his own responsibility, but it was also something where people in the movement on the outside were doing this, right? Like this was happening. I mean, this is how Asada gets to Cuba, right? This
Right.
is how, um, other folks were able. Kwesi Balagoon, ended up escaping, multiple times, as did your father, and like the idea would be to escape and to get back involved in the struggle in some ways for many of these folks, and I think that he had to live through that period in which this was a very real possibility into one where it becomes much more difficult, and he's also older and he's also under tighter and tighter restrictions where it really makes this basically impossible for him. And that is really in many ways the point for him at which he kind of changes his practice, and at least in the book that's the way it reads, is
That's
that this is the point at which he's like, okay, now I need to engage in the work of politicizing these young juvenile life without parole folks, many of whom are out in Philadelphia and other places now. Um,
congratulations.
yeah, absolutely. And then also, working with the lifers movement, helping develop and lead that, and figuring out these other forms of organizing and these other forms of political education that he could go in so that he could continue to do that work. And I mean, I just wanted to ask you too, because you mentioned your own, dreams of liberating him, and thinking and organizing and thinking in that way. Um, and then coming through to this, okay, we're gonna have to do it through the system. We're gonna have to, shift the way that we approach this now because conditions have changed. Um, and I know that was a question you wanted to talk about a little bit too, is like how your
Yeah.
father assessed changing conditions. But yeah, some thoughts there.
Yeah, so he was a strategist, a military guy, a very intelligence guy, like a a black 007 style of dude or whatever. But like I just told Sisters on Seas of the Whirlwind podcast that I hadn't shared it with a lot of people, mainly because of intelligence and security concerns, and it's not the things that we do in the movement. But I had went from this where my sister talks about really kind of hurt space with my dad when we had found out that he was abusive to my mom, and that some of the things that my mom had said, historically on the low when she would get upset about my dad were true. And he was like, yeah, I did that. And I was like, oh, nigga, it's on. Like, you don't do that shit. Like, you don't do that shit, period, to my mom or nobody else. Like, I don't give a fuck. Like, it's on. When I see you, it's on site. Like, and so I'm coming up to see you about that. So he's like, all right. And so, I'm as young and as strong as I ever was going to get and as viral and just cock diesel as I was ever going to be. And so I was like, dude, like, I love you and all of that, but like, it's a part of me that's really like I need to, be violent or physically touch you, and that's a whole nother ideological thing, right? But when I got there, it was so deep and so profound about my dad in a certain type of way is, he basically, before I could even launch into my whole tirade, he's like, look, I just want to say something before we even really, and he said, I know you were saying like, that how could a father do certain things to, their child's mother and blah, blah, blah. And he was saying, in so many words, like, I apologize for all of that. And I'm not your father, like I'm not that father, like the type of father that you're talking about. I'm not. And I know I'm not, and and I fucked up, and I don't really, it's nothing I can really say in that context. So you're right, I'm not your dad in that way. I'm not the dad. I'm not a dad, You know, I'm this dude, did the revolutionary thing, and I fucked up on the dad shit. And that way that you're talking about, yeah, I was younger and was abusive to your mom, and so I have to eat that. So I'm sorry. I fucked up. I apologize. And I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting some defense or some, and it just took all the wind out of my sails and shit. And I just fucking sat there and cried, because I was like, damn, nigga, like, what the fuck? What are you talking about? Why are you owning this shit? Why are you owning it? Why are you being accountable to your shit? Like, I don't want you to be accountable. I want you to not be accountable. And then I'll have some way to just be in my space, my fucked up space. And so, because I couldn't be in that space, I was fucked up a little bit. I was like, damn. I was like, well, what the fuck does that, where does that leave me at? What the fuck? And so I can't do my machismo shit. I can't be, not that I was going to win any fucking thing with my dad or whatever, any rumble or whatever, but, all the way from there to me growing to a space of reverence and saying, bro, you did your thing, blah, 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 blah. I got a couple homies. We should put together a squad to come and liberate you. And he was like, oh, great. I thought you'd never ask, And so, here's the way to do it, and sent us his Bible of military extraction. And this is what you're going to need. You're going to need an admin officer. You're going to need a weapons officer. You're going to need a travel officer. You're going to need an intelligence officer. And that's going to be you, because I can't deal with anybody else. You're going to have to vet everybody who you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And they're going to have to jump through all of these hoops. The one on fire, they're going to jump through the barbed wire hoop. They're going to jump through the razor hoop. And, if they don't jump through them, then y'all not coming to liberate. And so I was constantly, starting new cells because you didn't pass this, or we couldn't triangulate on round. Now you're the intelligence officer. I'm the military. You're the weapons. He's the travel. And if you couldn't do all of that with Maroon, then he was like, no deal. And it got to a point, it was so frustrating. It was so frustrating that it was like, bro, you don't really want to be liberated. You just playing fucking games with this military bullshit. You fucking bullshit. He like, oh, I'm not bringing y'all up here to die. Y'all just want to come up to die, huh? Because I know I've been through, and I'm telling you, it has to go like this only. And if y'all can't do it, then I'm stuck here then. But don't come at me with the bullshit, because I know what it's going to take. And it's going to take this. And if y'all can't do it, then it's great, whatever. But this is what it takes, And I'm like, and we weren't ready. I recognize now, we weren't ready. We were really good. We were really close, but we weren't ready. And we never met the criteria of the numbers of people. It was at a certain point, it was like, we can't get all of these people together. We can't get all these officers together under the intelligence. And we were trying to cut it short. Like, all right, instead of, 8 officers, 4 of us going to take on two responsibilities, 2 roles, And even with that, it's just, and it goes to another intersectional conversation around how many people it takes to do a certain job. They say how many people took to screw on a light bulb, whatever. But it's a real thing in the context of even these rubrics that we have for organizing. You got your president, you got your secretary, you got your treasurer, you got your, that. And so in the not-for-profit world, you need that. That's all you need. You need like 3 or 4 people. And you got a whole structure. You can fake all the rest. But you got 3 or 4 people in that structure. They do what they do. You got the money. You got the paperwork. You got the, okay. And it boiled down to that, but in an extractive sense, in a liberatory sense. And you need X, Y, and Z to make it happen. If you don't have that, you kind of playing with your life.
I want to real quick, Jerry, before you move on, go back to what, because I think Russ moved from something real powerful. You're talking about when you learned about the abuses that Maroon enacted on your mom, right? And a big part of the book, throughout the book, is Maroon being very open about the way in which he harmed, abused, right, manipulated these various women throughout his life, right? And the children who came from some of those relationships end up just the consequences of that, of him not being dad in that way. Towards the end of the book, Maroon, in his solitary confinement and him becoming an old head, starts to really reflect and transform these notions. One, who he was, and the concept of violence again, right? And really questioning the utility and the necessity of violence, and not just violence in a political revolutionary kind of way, but the violence that he enacted on everyday people, right? Which why he names patriarchy as the number one evil, even above racism here in the United States, because it was learned. He starts the book talking about how he didn't have that love from his mom. She was very responsible for him and took that responsibility as a mother very serious, but he felt that she didn't love him and show him love, and that he was looking for that motherly love in these different relationships with these women, while still being very bitter.
That's a good one.
George and Soledad brother, right? Those first letters in Soledad brothers, like, oh my God, George, leave your mother alone, please, right? Like, they're just some really hard, just blaming this, just writing to her, dear mom, and like just pages of like, my God.
No, that's a good
one. And so but again, this learned violence that we talked about, this learned violence, and him not being there, whatever your experience is through childhood, I'm sure that's a whole other book that could be written, right? Your understanding of what needed to be done was violence. I'm gonna go walk up into SCI, whatever, right? And go put paws on this man.
This is about to be violent.
On, right? The state been putting paws on every time he goes into a new facility. They put him, so it doesn't strike me right. It doesn't surprise that Maroon is like, all right, right? Because all he's getting is paws put on him. But your understanding was, or even of love or whatever, it's like, all I understand is violence, and all I understand is this particular violence. And he met that up front. He's like, pause for a second, because I done reflected and transformed, right? And turn that around where you didn't know what to do. So many of our organizations, so many of us in the movements, right, get stuck in that and don't know what to do when it's not, and literally don't know. And then the tears and the breakdown of what you're holding. And so for me, that notion of love, that understanding of masculinity in a different way, even though he doesn't talk about it, or Sami's book talks about gender, masculinity, and this concept very well. Maroon doesn't explicitly talk about it, but he does talk about it. And in your story,
you can feel it.
You're manifesting it and you're seeing that, right? That transformation. And for me, it hit so powerful because, I grew up in that way, right? I idolized political prisoners. I joined struggle because I wanted to die. That was my thing. I said it since high school. The greatest gift you can give your people is your life. And if I could die for my people, that'd be the greatest thing, right, on the planet, all the way up until there was no knock on my door for me to join some underground group, because they didn't really exist, and they're, the war I was preparing for never came. And so now I'm 47 years old, still here, right, not dead, running a nonprofit. But that was my understanding of love until, right, I have kids, and especially my son, who didn't come out, doesn't like sports, doesn't like horse around, doesn't like super bravados, very gentle, very artistic, very soft, and the question was posed to me like, well, how are you going to toughen him up? He was about 2 years old, and they asked me, well, how are you going to toughen him up?
At two.
And it rocked me. It rocked. My baby plays with My Little Ponies, right? And I was just like, if that's what my baby wants, I'm buying my baby 147 My Little Ponies, because that's what my baby wants. And I had to transform the way I presented masculinity, the way I understood love, the way I understand to be the person that he needed to be. I don't know if I would have been able to do that without him, specifically him being a boy, right? Because I have a daughter, but specifically him being a boy. So when I'm reading that and what Maroon did, and then Maroon's approach to you, his son, even if he doesn't want to articulate himself as like, I'm not that dad, his son, there's still a responsibility for how I'm going to manifest this and how I'm going to demonstrate this type of masculinity. He stood 10 toes down. He owned it. I know what you want to do. I'm not going to say we're not going to rumble, but right, I'm going to approach it. I'm going to approach it differently. That rocked you, transformed you.
Yeah, really.
Right into the Russ you are now, which is the Russ is a very different Russ from even the Russ I met in 2011, 2012, 2013. Right. And so I wanted to, before we go into the other stuff about freeing folks from prisons or whatever, I think one of the biggest lessons from this book, and even talking with you, Russ, and everything that you're sharing from your personal story indirectly, right, are those huge lessons of Maroon and that transformation that he made from the violence we were talking about to a very different type of way of being with each other, of being man, of being revolutionary, right, of being a Maroon, right, that I think really needs to be elevated.
Yeah. That is excellent, Hiram. And I didn't say anything about the relationship that my father has with my daughter and my son or whatever, but with the grandkids or whatever. But also, like, yeah, I had a daughter also, and my daughter kind of changed me that way because I was all rigid and hard and street shit and trying to be like, yeah. And she was just like, my daughter was like, My Little Pony or whatever, and I'm just like, then I'm like, bro, how you gonna have a daughter? You actually will have to, like, you gotta change. Like, if you don't change, it's not gonna be a good look for you or her. Like, she's gonna come out all screwed up. And then when she come out screwed, she's gonna look at you and be like, bro, you didn't nurture me, you couldn't hug me, you couldn't kiss me, you couldn't, because it was a point where I was so street and so hard, like I was figuring how I'm gonna hug my baby and how I'm gonna kiss the baby. And and I was like, and so the illest part about it though was like I had to hurry up and get it together because my dad was projecting that I was something that I wasn't. He's like, boy, and this is like some Maroon mystique, like some reverse psychology, what me and my business partner call mental jujitsu. It's like mentalists do. They'll put the thought in your mind already, even though it ain't what it is. Like, oh man, you the best dad, and you doing this, and ideologies you gonna be giving that baby, and I'm thinking, bro, what are you talking about? Like, I can barely hold the baby. Like I'm scared to even, I don't know what I'm doing. Right. And so this guy thinking that I gotta figure it out. I gotta create softness. I gotta create emotional stability. I have to create emotional maturity. I have to learn how to love. I need to learn how to say, I love you. I need to learn how to, be vulnerable in a way that can be accessible to my child. And that process, stretched me out in a way that, nothing else had ever, and people recognize it. And people was like, oh, you this and you into that and you soft. Well, yeah, I'm soft. Yeah, I'm soft. I love being soft. And yes, I have a feminine side. Yes. But, that doesn't take away from, I'm never going to lose the hard side. The hard side, it's always going to be there or whatever, so it's like a sword. If I need to pull it out, then I got it, whatever. But until that, I don't need that. I need this, I need the divine feminine to show through because the masculine doesn't show through so much, And so with my daughter, that was evident and needed, and still to this day, and even with my son,
And it was a political prisoner, right? It was Nahanda Abiodun in exile in Cuba who taught me that lesson back when my daughter was little, before my son was born. And I'll never forget, I had a Malcolm t-shirt. She wanted it, so I gave her the shirt off my back because that's Nahanda Abiodun, right? Whatever you want. He came back the next day. It was all cut up and stylized in Caribbean fashion and like low cut or whatever. And I'm like, oh. And I thought she sexualized the shirt. Nahanda Abiodun stood at about 5'11", almost 6 foot, barefoot, right? One of the women who was a part of the team who liberated Sada Shakur from prison. This one was
and over 200 pounds.
And over to, like, this is a solid, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
This woman looked at me and she was looking dead in my eye and was like, baby, if I ever hear you question a woman's clothing or dress ever again, we're gonna have some serious problems, brother. Do you hear me? And I was like, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, right? And just started that process of really understanding and really breaking down my role as in my relationship to my daughter, and specifically what I was teaching her, right? And the things that I was socializing or shouldn't socialize her in or whatever, because I'm so focused on the struggle and the movement and the whatever, and these very hard, rigid understandings of what that meant. And she hit the pause button and was like, Your number one struggle is that little girl. Your number one struggle, right, is the family, which goes back to Malcolm, which she learned it from Malcolm, right? Was that. And so being very conscious of even how I spoke to her, never questioning my daughter's dress, having conversations with her, but never questioning her dress, never questioning, like, oh, you got little boys calling the phone or whatever. We can have a conversation about it, but never, right, doing these, so that she never gets accustomed to men doing this type of thing to her. Never had a problem with my daughter, right? Because I talked to her as a human being, not as my property, not as something that I had to, you know what I'm saying, whatever. But again, that had to come from a political prisoner whose whole life was violence, who took the time to reflect, look back at the generation coming next. So I'm like, Mom, I want to be just like you, and I hope I die in a blaze of glory. And she's like, no. She's like, no, absolutely not, right? And redirected that. And so, you know, yeah, just this piece around love and the reshaping of masculinity, of the understanding of the role of the family inside of the struggle, right, from these folks, is these huge lessons that you can only get when you're talking to folks like Russell, the family of these folks who had to live the consequences of not having them there, as well as the state repression that came as a result of their family members' actions.
This is a beautiful conversation, gentlemen, and I don't have much to add to that point other than I was a little boy who played with My Little Pony, so Hyrum, you know, for better or worse, like, you have your model here. Like,
I love that.
But I will say, you know, Russell, you sent some other questions that you kind of wanted to get to, and one of them, well, a couple of them had to do with kind of the nonprofit industrial complex, and, you know, so I wanted to give you space to ask some questions today too.
Yeah.
So there's one.
Go
ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I have my thought. Go ahead. What were you saying?
No, I was going to point to one of the things you wrote down and sent to us, but you go ahead and you put it in your own words.
No, point it out. Go ahead.
Well, just that you talked about your father's interactions and critical analysis in general of NGOs and kind of state silent war tactics. So maybe say a little bit more about.
And Hyrum really did a good job on that also. But I think, and especially with a whole new generation of young folks coming into political education, coming into social justice work, you know, so forth and so on, that the landscape around doing this work just has changed. You know, it's changed, you know, over the past 20 some odd years. And, you know, what they experience and what they come to the movement with, their tools, their knowledge base, their set of abilities, a lot of times, you know, revolves around academia. It will revolve around technology. You know, it will revolve around their abilities to create, build, access, and nurture a network, or their network, their personal, or they may be influencer. You know, that's a part of the, you know, rubric today, or that's a part of, you know, how people see people. And so if they have a little influence and then they get some politics or what have you, or come across, you know, some type of critical analysis or social justice understanding, then they will use that in their everyday life and, you know, everyday work. And it has just become, I think, tough for people in my space and even people in a higher space than me, and some, you know, in a different understanding than me, about how NGOs and not-for-profit 501c3s actually really work, and what are the actual goals, what are the actual strategies, what are these NGOs and not-for-profits actually trying to do, you know. And one of the things I want to point out that most people don't really understand is most NGOs have a vision and a mission. And so the mission is to stop homelessness, or to feed the children, or to stop cancer or heart disease, or whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, the most important thing that I can say to people for them to understand is that most of these entities, for lack of better terms, are structured, set up to maintenance themselves. And maintaining themselves may be having a very robust or strong fundraising apparatus. And that fundraising apparatus may cover everything from like in-kind donations of material things, like cars, houses, boats, whatever, anything material that's not money, an in-kind donation, or there may be financial donations, just straight cash, hand to hand, pass the bucket, Farrakhan pass the trash can around at the $1 Million March, wave a green dollar, the green wave, whatever it may be. They bring in finances, and the most important thing is that maintenance a lot of times requires that 501c3, that not-for-profit org, to actually go against its mission, to go against the vision, to not actually want to solve the problem. Because if we solve the problem of hunger or cancer or whatever it is, then we don't have a job anymore. It's the same as police officers and prison guards. The job of the FOP is to make sure actually that crime stays on the table. The FOP wouldn't be good if crime all went away, or if they all fought to make crime go away. Then there would be no need for a fraternal order of police or police unions, or any union for that matter. Any union is fighting to keep the jobs and working for the union, for the people who are paying them dues. Their job is to continue to make sure, if it's a car union, to continue to make sure that we're going to pay lobbyists. We're going to make sure people want to buy cars. We're going to lobby for emissions, or whatever it is that keeps this car industry going. It's our job to push that. I don't care if it's polluting gas or not polluting gas, whatever it is. And it may look like it's contradictory to what it is we say we support. But at the end of the day, in order to keep this ship afloat, we have to have those things that we're advocating for. We say that we're fighting for. We want free political prisoners or whatever. But if all the political prisoners get free, somebody's going to be out of a job. Somebody's going to be out of some money. Somebody's going to be out of some books getting written. Somebody's going to be out of some documentaries getting made. Somebody's going to be out of. So I just wanted to put that out there. You guys, please jump in on that.
Yeah, no, that part in the book where Maroon is talking about conversations that he had with Fred Ho, the former revolutionary Fred Ho, who was out of New York City, and the NGOization of the movement, right? And it was a call in the book. It's a call for reigniting that fire, that revolutionary fire in the American population, the U.S. population, again, because of things like what you just mentioned, Russ, the non-profitization of so-called struggle that has led more to careerism than anything moving on the streets. The movement being taken over by university administrators, what they call, but it's these academics, it's these folks with all of their languages and different framing, right? Moving things from class struggles to culture wars, right? Class war to like culture wars, and all this other language doesn't resonate with the people. And in that he talks about, and again, it's funny, folks definitely have to read the book. Maroon talking about Fred Ho pushing him to use his shank, right? And so for folks who know anything about prison, shanks are like the homemade blades that folks use inside. But for Maroon and for Fred Ho, it was Maroon's writing that became his shank. And Maroon talks about, again, right, the transformation from the violence or whatever, that his writing became his shank. His teachings, his lessons became his shank. And Fred Ho calling on him to wield it, to wield that. And this is where you get Maroon the Implacable behind Jared's shoulder there. That book, which was his shank that Fred Ho had called upon him to write, so that folks can wake up and break out of that slumber and not get caught up in the where the movement is trapped now, behind ivory towers, behind language that's inaccessible to folks. Russ, this is how we started the whole conversation this morning. Inaccessible to people. The whole nonprofitization of thing, waiting for these nonprofits to, I don't know, save us or do whatever they're supposed to do. And instead, he talks about people like finding their Hydra. And for Maroon, right, relying on this character of the Hydra, this multi-headed beast that fights, and that, you know, you cut its head off, but there's still more heads that keep going. Like, and it's his critique of centralized organization, right? He has very sharp and very
What is
strong
centralized organization?
Centralized organization, primarily in what he's talking about, is a criticism of traditional Marxist vanguard organizations, a revolutionary party with a central committee, right, that operates under democratic centralism. So there's a central committee that kind of lays down the marching orders for the rest of the party. And so he has very strong criticisms about that approach of organizing in those organizations, which he refers to as dragon organizations. Dragon, a hat tip to Ho Chi Minh, right? And his concept of when the prison doors open up, the real dragon will fly out, right? It's a nod to George Jackson, right?
Yeah.
These folks who believe in Marxist-Leninist vanguard parties. The Hydra is the opposite of that, this multi-headed beast, where he refers to, in a very Cedric Robinson kind of way of telling of the Black radical tradition that predates Marxism, right, or Marx's analysis of capitalism in Europe at that time, and the development of scientific socialism, of the way that these enslaved populations from Haiti through Latin America through all over were freeing themselves free of a vanguard party or that type of structure, right? And it's that criticism as well that Cedric is making, that Maroon is kind of like building upon. And so for him, that is the Hydra. The Maroon is the Hydra. It fights, it lives. You can cut its head off, but there's a whole other one, and another one will grow, and another one will grow. And there is no stopping this fight until liberation is won, right? And so he talks about when Fred Ho asks him to wield his shank, that is his writing in the book. He says, every oppressed people have a Hydra slumbering in their mind. On the surface, it might appear that they're going about their business, but dig a little in the soil, sprinkle some water, and allow a bit of sunlight to filter down into the tunnels, and you will see something sprouting. People of conscience awake. Feet that have forgotten how to march take the streets again. And that is his call, right, for folks to abandon these other institutions, abandon these structures, even abandon these ways of organizing, right, and find again your consciousness with each other through this sort of Maroonish approach of life. And the guerrilla Maroon is what he talks about, as opposed to treaty Maroons, because we know he articulates that Maroons is a complicated thing, right? Like Maroons are a very complicated thing. Taki's Rebellion is a great book on that. I think, Joe Horn writes about, Joy James writes about that. There's very different, Maroons were liberated folks, but they also were slave catchers in a lot of ways. And so, he talks about these guerrilla Maroons. But using his words, using his books again to push back against what has happened to our movements and the capturing of our struggles, and bringing it back to everyday people, sprinkling a little water, feeding that a little bit, and letting that natural revolutionary and urge to be free and capacity to be free sprout and take form.
So one of the things I really want to just add on there is that the whole use of the terminology, I think it's a great use of terminology of Fred Ho saying to Maroon, I think it's important that we try to use your writings as a tool to try to help you get out, or to get out to people, to politically educate them. And that at that time, Fred was starting an organization called Scientific Soul Sessions, and I'm on the streets with him. And so I see what's happening in the context of him being a accomplished musician, kind of a master bass saxophonist, and able to, play orchestra to, freestyle or what have you. But I say all of that to say that because he was this great musician, a lot of other musicians gravitated to him, specifically in the context of trying to use art as a tool for liberation, which is a lovely concept and something that should be done. And I would add that where the conversation and where things got murky, specifically with Fred and Scientific Soul Session, is two things. One specifically, and this is for folks across the board, not just Fred and Scientific Soul Sessions, is it's a very thin line when we're doing work for political prisoners and we're monetizing off of it. And that thin line of monetizing off the political prisoner and just doing the work to try to liberate them can get blurry. And with Fred, it got very blurry in the context of him saying to my dad, we want to use your writings as a shank or what have you. But in all reality, my dad's writings have always been out in the world. And they've always been out in the world through anarchist pamphlet publications. And so those anarchist pamphlet publications were just brought together. So there was this whole kind of, again, from a scholarly place, from a place of putting out ideology, from a place of organizing young people, there was this ideology of, we're going to put out this new book of Maroons. It's called Maroon the Implacable. Well, actually, it's just collected writings that have already been out for free. And so my dad always said, y'all clowns, I'm not a writer. I'm a revolutionary. Y'all can't tell. I'm not going to write y'all no whole. I'm not here. The book ain't going to free me. All that y'all talking about is great and all that cool, whatever. I'm not doing that. I'm not writing books for y'all. I'm not a writer. Oh, but y'all great and blah, blah, And so, that part. But yeah, it never landed well or never felt good. That also Fred, taught folks who they called him sensei. And so people in Scientific Soul Sessions, musicians, were under the understanding that it was okay to make art, to make music, to monetize off of political prisoners. That was a Scientific Soul Session based understanding. That you could call Mumia, you could call Maroon and be like, yeah, I'm doing this music, it's going to cost this much, or if we make this much, I'll give you this percentage and I'll take that percentage. Those type of, was the shank conversation for Fred in the context of, yeah, we're going to do all the work, but, this money's going to come in. We're going to use those monies to do this work around your case. And, all of that may have been done. I think the point of teaching people how to monetize off of certain folks' struggle is a very slippery slope. And the whole shank and using the shank could be ideologically a way for someone to come at a political prisoner, in that way and say, hey, these are tools for your liberation. And a prison under duress will take anything. Most prisoners under duress will take anything. And our political prisoners, for the most part, have been and are dealing with people that, they have to, because we're not that good at liberating them, or else they wouldn't have to jump through hoops and take deals and make videos and write 100 books and still be locked up like Mumia after writing 100 books that other people monetize off of.
Yeah. I mean, that's heavy. And, that definitely, it gets back to something we talked about earlier too, in terms of the way that we can reproduce kind of extractive or abusive structures too within our movements. I did have something I wanted to say. Hyrum, I saw you come off mute. Did you have something you wanted to add real quick?
No,
I know you have to leave. Yeah. I just wanted to say too about that piece, the Hydra piece, is that it's a very interesting piece, again, to talk about your father and the challenging way that he writes, the way that he's very critical, but I think there's interesting aspects of that piece too, because even though it is published, a lot of your father's stuff was published by anarchists, as you said. That book comes out on PM Press, which is an anarchist press, and they have also produced writings from a lot of other, great Black revolutionary figures, whether it's Kwesi Balagoon, whether it's the Look for Me in the Whirlwind book. I know Matt Meyer has been a part of a lot of the projects there and things like that. So shout out to them for that work. But also, even in that press, like in that context, he makes sure to say, what I'm describing to you may sound like anarchism, but I am not an anarchist. He does say, he does allude to Marx several times within it, and he does talk about the importance of working class struggle throughout that. That's a constant kind of theme. And he, he also is approaching this and thinking about this in that quilombo period, and so this is also a part of like the political education that he's doing with folks inside. And it's also in a period when revolutionary movements have really declined. That piece comes out in 2006 originally. And, there's really not a lot to speak of, right? And so I see it also as like trying to say, okay, we don't want movements where they can just chop off our head. And this actually connects to, for me, to thinking about something like the Stop Cop City movement, which would have been really fascinated to get his reflections on, of, a movement where you have different groups of people with different ideologies. And they're saying, you know what, we may have our disagreements behind closed doors. We may have our sectarian arguments and our arguments about strategies and tactics, but publicly, we're going to defend each other. We're going to show up for each other. And we're not going to let the state isolate one group of us or another, even if we might disagree with some of the things that certain folks do within the movement. We're going to have that kind of united front amongst ourselves of supporting each other in that. And that's one example. The other one to me is to think about something like the axis of resistance today, thinking about Palestine and Lebanon and Ansar Allah and, even a state like Iran and, Syria, and how, obviously it's very complicated. They're going against one of the most powerful armies in the world, backed by the United States military, which is the largest military in the world, right? And, you have all of these different forces who obviously, there is genocide going on in Gaza, and we should name that. And there is like a completely disproportionate amount of violence that all these people are being subjected to for daring to try to struggle. But at the same time, like they have this structure in certain ways. And this is what I see your father talking about with the Hydra, is the structure and having questions about how do we create structures that can be durable, right? And that can keep up the fight, even if you take out the leader, even if you take out the central committee, they can continue to fight. And we do see that, in terms of these resistance groups continuing to be able to do that. And so I think we can see examples again that like might help us to link some of what your father was thinking about from a theoretical vantage point, and also a historical, pulling up the history again, as Hyrum was talking about in terms of the Maroon struggles and things like that, to present day examples. And obviously we don't have him here to offer his reflections on today, but I would be very interested, of course, to have been able to talk to him about those things and understand what he thought from them. So I know we have to wind down. Hyrum has to get going in a few minutes. Is there anything that either of you wanted to say as we kind of wrap up?
Hyrum?
No, I think I urge everyone to go out, grab the book. It's an easy read, very powerful, a lot of stuff to think about in there, but it's not drowned in too much jargon or inaccessible language. It's fascinating book. I read it in a day. And so go out and read it, discuss it, debate with it. I was arguing with the book and debating the book. It's fascinating. Do yourself the pleasure and go ahead and grab that book.
Go ahead, Russell. You have anything?
I would just say thank you to both of you. I was probably more excited about this interview than probably any of them because I value both of you and your ideologies and your ability to kind of push to the places that I feel like we need to be and have the kind of uncomfortable, sometimes tough conversations that are really needed, and have a certain ability to analyze what we're going through. And we need that. We need, this platform to help give good analysis. And so I encourage you, Jared, to continue the work of making it plain to people, making it as simple as possible. Obviously, you're well read, Hyman's well read enough, folks are well read enough to keep a high level standard of conversation. But the new goal for me is to be able to bring it to layman's terms for people to understand. And I think you guys did a really excellent job today. So thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all. It means a lot to me.
I mean, that means so much to me, Russell, and I know for Hyrum as well. And I would say too that like I really appreciate you also on being clear and pushing us to be as accessible as possible, because I know that's something for myself that sometimes, because I read these books and I study this stuff, and I just throw out the terms and they, I know what they mean. I assume everybody else does, and so somebody actually dropped a comment to me the other day about that, so I think that was a great thing, and
I've been getting it a lot from younger people, just like, we don't know what you're talking about, bro. And so I'm like, geez, I'm like,
no. So thank you so much. And I just want to echo what Hiram said about the book, which it is excellent. I mean, I don't know that there is a memoir from someone, a Black liberationist in the United States that is like this, and I say that quite genuinely, because from the level of detail that he goes into about his life, as well as about actions, which is often something that people don't want to talk about because of the risks that are involved. I know he thought very carefully about how to do that, but still divulged a whole lot, which most books just don't do. You more often get that from the books that are writing against these folks, like demonizing and saying this is what they did, whereas he really talks about it and tries to talk about it from that revolutionary perspective, and gives a lot there, of just for people who would be interested in an action movie or something like that. This book is quite like an action movie in different points, but then still gets to all of these really deep and challenging kind of political questions. And again, like the self-critical lens of like being able to lay the groundwork for us to have the conversation that you and Hyrum really had about, masculinity today, and about, patriarchy and violence and abuse and things like that. That doesn't happen if he doesn't write that book in such a self-critical way, to be willing to challenge those hard questions, which I think is the thing you were talking about earlier when you're talking about that powerful meeting that you and your father had, is like, not everybody can do that. That's a very difficult thing, and
it's part of, I talk about my father having these mystiques, like things that he can do. It's a mystical thing about him that's not normal, or you don't find it everywhere. And that's definitely one. And his ability to be able to ideologically turn on a dime, kind of, sort of, like, that is one to me. Because, and he talks about it, but a lot of times, your ego is in the ideas because you've done pumped them for 50 years or whatever it is, and then now you have to be like, oh, I'm not that, I'm this, or I don't believe in that anymore, I believe in this. And then it's the whole conversation of, oh, well, why was you pumping that for 50 years? Well, I was pumping that for 50 years because I didn't know any better, and to be able to own those type of things, a lot of times, when we get onto ideas, it's hard to let them go and hard to say it wasn't the right thing, actually. I was doing the wrong thing for a long time. Yeah. And especially when you're in a position where people look up to you, kind of, sort of, and people come to you for information, and they've been coming to you for information, and you may have fed them this information for 20 years or whatever. And now you divorce from it, and all of the people who have been studying around and with you are like, oh, snap, we got a divorce with that, or we have to do some studies or see why or whatever. But at the end of the day, that has never been an easy thing for me, and I still work at it. But I love having that model. I love knowing that my father challenged himself in that way, and I'm constantly challenging myself in that way. And that's one of the tougher ones, to be able to be like, oh, we were doing the wrong ideology. Like we thought, my cheese more, we thought, grabbing the guns and going out when the sister said, y'all, wait, brothers, wait a minute. Can we talk to y'all? No, y'all ain't doing, we about to go handle this because we the brothers and we going to handle the brother stuff. And the women looking like, oh, it's a brother thing. We thought that we was working together. But when it comes time for y'all to move out like that, then y'all get in this mindset where y'all can't hear us, And so that's another just conversation, in general about all of the women that are not intentionally written out of the book. Phyllis Hill, the woman who brought in 2 weapons, a shotgun and a 45 into the prison to liberate my father. My mom, Sister Love, the women, my aunts, all of the people who contributed over years, and the treatment of them and how they were, loved or not loved, or validated or not validated. Even in this book, some of them just are not validated. They are not there. Their stories aren't as illuminated, when they are as great or better, than Maroon. If you bringing guns up into the prison, come on, that's not every day. And you need to be, from our side, you need to be at least talked about and recognized, and the sister did that, got caught, roughed up, all of that, did years in prison, came out doing the work. Don't come talk to me. I don't want no hoopla. You ain't got to do no interviews. No, I'm just back to the work. I did my time. Now I'm back in the streets doing the work. As good or better than it was then, and topping people out in the street that have been doing work. I've been in prison for 7 years trying to liberate Maroon. Now I'm back out and I'm doing the work, and that's, come on, that's unsung hero for me. And those type of people and that type of action has happened in Maroon's life. It couldn't get in the book in every aspect, but there are countless number of women who are responsible for, Maroon's survival while he was incarcerated and sometimes his liberation. So that part, is super important.
That's really, I appreciate you saying that and sharing that. And there was so many. He has a reflection at some point, and this is something that I remember you talking about actually at one of the rallies I was at that you presented at. I think it was something related to the Move family, like when they were still having the final push to get maybe the 40. It was an anniversary of Move, and it was at a school here in Philly. And you spoke, and you talked about your father coming to some conclusion that you all had done so much and so many people had sacrificed so much to try to get him out, and that because of the histories of how he was, as he said to you, I wasn't really your father, kind of the harm, I guess, that you could say that he felt like was a result of his actions in certain ways, that he really didn't want people spending any more time trying to get him out. And he talks about that a little bit in the book, but what was your experience with that? And I know that eventually you did, but how was that? What are your reflections on that period?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. Like I was saying earlier, the inability for not just myself, but for community in general, and I'm speaking to the community now, the inability for us to liberate our people outside of whatever strategies we have now, legal strategies, or through the wall or whatever. The inability for us to extract people from the prison system, which is not impossible, because Kwesi Balagoon is an example, obviously Asada is an example, and my father is an example, but we just are not in that mindset. And so because of it, we end up with a lot of other strategies, and a lot of other things. But yes, there were people, situations, scenarios that look quantitatively different, and I know that a lot of times, when I'm speaking, and I was just out at the Black Panther Museum in Oakland, and me and Mike were together, and just the intersection of Philadelphia politics, Rizzo.
Mike Africa Jr., right? You're talking
Yes.
about Mike Africa
Mike
Jr.
Africa
Yeah,
Jr. Yes.
yeah.
Rizzo, and just the bathing of the city and the state in a certain level of violence that was so high that it has the outcomes that it has. We are who we are. You are who you are. This platform is how it is through Rizzo and all of that. Because we come through, we have a certain knowledge, we have a certain understanding. Even in that place still today known as Philadelphia, there is a residue of that. It's still a certain police, type of presence, and the police in their minds and their ideologies, because they know their history, they know Rizzo, they move in a very specific type of way. The FOP moves in a very specific type of way. Perfect example is them, finding boxes of Mumia stuff, and Larry Krasner being the left DA. But somehow that stuff can't be used. It looks like right there over in the corner is Mumia's liberation. But somehow, through the FOP, through powers that be, through whatever, and this is the only DA that we could probably count on. All the DAs prior, and Abrams, all them folks, you wasn't going to even hear that it was a boxer. That box has been there in the corner with Mumia since, all the DAs or whatever, since he's been in jail. But it comes out that and we think, oh, snap, we can get that. And no, that's not actually, because of the history, because of the institutionalization, of state power in a certain type of way. And so, yeah, but I feel like I went off your question. I want to make sure I answered the question. I feel like I went off. What was?
Well, I'll get back to the question in a sec, but I want to say some in response to what you just said too, because it's like my wife talking about my mother-in-law, in the period of move, and, and saying like that all the families understood that if a move member or somebody else came to their door because they were running from the police in that scenario, that they would welcome them in. And I think that was like, as you talk about these legacies of like Rizzo and things like that, like it's like kind of on both levels. And I mean, it's unfortunate that in your father's escape attempts that he had to deal with Western Pennsylvania or Central Pennsylvania, right. Like to right. Because it probably would have been a different scenario if he had been in and around Philadelphia, right. In terms of the willingness of people to help him, yeah. But the question that I asked was just the point that we didn't really touch on, was that point where he got to where he was like, I don't want you all to spend any more time with this.
Yes. So basically, like I said, through liberation attempts and things like that, and also through him getting older, also him seeing how the movement had changed, and him saying like, oh, it's going to take all of this to get me out. Even people approaching him to be like, let's use the book to try to liberate him. He just like, that's where we at now? Y'all going to try to say that, oh, me writing a book is going to get me out? He like, y'all tripping. He like, y'all not even activists. Y'all not even organizers. Y'all not even, y'all below all of that because y'all trying to tell me that I can write myself out of prison against this state. Y'all telling me that if I keep writing, and I'm looking at better writers than me, I'm looking at Mumia, and y'all talking about, and my dad is like, it's no way that I'm gonna do better than some of the people that already got stuff out. Yes, I'm maroon. Yes, I got my own ideology. Yes, I escaped from prison and all that. I'm not going to be telling all of that probably to an autobiography. So now you're talking about maroon and implacable. Well, I've been putting writings out, ain't nothing or whatever, but that's not a way. That's not a liberatory practice. Yes, it's a liberatory practice in the context of freeing yourself, through writing, maybe freeing somebody else. But in the context of state oppression and them got me in solitary confinement in a prison, inside the prison, below the prison, in the basement, that's not going to get me out of prison. And the fact that y'all are offering that to me says a lot to me about who y'all are and who I'm dealing with. And of course, from a place of love and all that and understanding, and it's a certain level of development, Fred, that you need to understand me, because you're at a point of development where you're trying to use these tools, and cool, I'll play with you. I'll enlighten you. I'll engage you. I'll sit with you on that. But in all reality, as he told them all from Scientific Soul Session, that ain't going to liberate me. Y'all can go ahead and put out my writings or whatever, but it's not going to free me. It's not going to liberate. Yes, it will get more people to know about my case. Which one of them people is going to bring me a shotgun and a 45? That part. That's how my dad was, and if that you ain't talking that conversation, then what are we talking about again? I'm trying to get out of here.
Yeah. And there was a real reality to that, especially in his case, because of, I mean, he kept accumulating life sentences, right? So it's like
Oh, you know that part. You did your research.
Well, just from the book, because he would talk about, all of his escape attempts, and then the times he successfully escaped, and then and so with all of that, yeah, I mean, at a certain point, it does absolutely become, the only way, because yeah, if you're dealing, I don't know how many life sentences he had by the time he was done.
So one thing to help your audience understand, though, which is a really important thing, though, if you escape from prison, and not even these days escaping from prison, if you end up in a situation where you and your homie or whatever was fighting somebody or whatever, and people end up dead, and it could be your homie, you're going to end up with that case, because the state just going to be like, we want somebody to be the murder. Somebody going to do life. We're going to get somebody in the slave ship. We got to put somebody on the ship for this body, right? Is the body gone? Somebody going to get the case. So you escape prison with your homie. They kill your homie. That's your body. If the cops, and what, that's your body. We're going to put, when you go to court and all that, Lumumba Fudge got killed while escaping with Russell Maroon Shoatz. Maroon, you got that body. Maroon, you must have killed your homie on the escape route or whatever. We don't care if it's a bullet in his head from forensics, say that it was the cops or whatever. We're giving you a life sentence for that, buddy. So that's, and that obviously happens in, street, people get killed and the cops be looking for somebody to put the body on. We looking. Help us. Yeah. Here's the picture of such and such. You seen this person or whatever. They say he got some information about, they don't have the information. They need you to help them with the information to identify, whoever it was, or, you want to tell on your friend or whoever it is. But at the end of the day, our job as the apparatus of the state is to get somebody for this murder, whether it's the right person, the wrong person, whatever it is. We want to get somebody for this murder and have them put into our carceral system.
Yeah, 100%. And it's also like a specific, the Abolitionist Law Center, which I know was involved in your father's cases over the years. They did a report at one point about which your father may have even influenced some of this work, actually, but about life without parole or death by incarceration within Pennsylvania, and showing that Philadelphia was one of the highest, I think it was the highest per capita death by incarceration or life imprisonment sentences. And so much of that also comes from these laws within Pennsylvania, which are specifically what you're talking about, which is like, if I'm in the car and somebody gets killed, even if it's somebody in our car, that, if we're somehow involved in something that's deemed as criminal activity, whether that's a robbery or whatever else, like that I could be charged with a life sentence associated with that. And that's one of the many kind of tactics that they use to really inflate these numbers. And a lot of that then does connect to the work that your father was doing around the Lifers Association in Pennsylvania, and around these kilombos with a lot of those folks, that, because also a lot of these people were teenagers in the context of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular. We're talking about some of these folks went in, they were 15, 16 years old and had life without parole sentences, so.
And we worked really hard, and within the prison liberation movement in Philadelphia, We had hard struggles and long, drawn out conversations whether or not to switch our energies from working directly on people's cases who had life without parole to juvenile life without parole, because the Supreme Court came down with rulings saying that if you had basically been incarcerated, as a juvenile, then you had the right to be released because you can't be charged as a juvenile for life. Your mental capacity isn't developed into 21 or better. And so we had to make a decision as folks working on cases like my father's to say, are we going to switch from that to working on the juvenile lifers cases? And we decided to do that, and we were very successful simply because those were low-hanging fruit. They probably would have got out at some point, and some of them are still being released or whatever. But at the end of the day, that was done. People like my father's cases were put on hold to do that work. And that kind of movement, spur or side work, I've seen spiral out to, for lack of better terms, not doing that work anymore, or at least not at the level with the same fervor because of the victory too. And so that's a whole nother conversation of once we taste the blood or once we get a little victory, do we get tired? Do we get full? Do we feel comfort food? Do we get the itis, off of, a little victory? Now we sitting back fat and, we done brought these PPs home. Let's get in celebratory mode. So a lot of things that I see or witness feel like to me are just celebratory things of so a perfect example to me is I'm working on a project to raise the embargoes off of Cuba, but also to lift those sanctions on Asada, and so, but, I see a whole bunch of Asada pages and Asada Instagram, Asada this, but I don't see any real solid work around Asada to get the state to stop putting $1 million bounties on her head. If you live in Jersey, then you need to be doing work around the state troopers and their police apparatus, because they are the ones continuing to say to the DOJ, the Department of Justice, that this woman down here killed one of our officers and we want to put $1 million bond on her head. And until we you people, us people, aren't doing enough work around that case, but we're doing a lot of celebration. We celebrate Asada a lot. We celebrate Asada, and that's great. We should celebrate Asada. We should also be celebrating Sundiata Acoli, who is still alive, who is part of that liberatory force, who was tortured and held in prison for many years, got an autobiography that we're working on for him to try to get some of that story out in his words, because he's a very a strategic thinker, also one who my father really admired, and so I say that if we can get more focused on, specific structures and ways and programming to try to do more work around some of these people who are getting old now, and if we don't get it done now, only God knows what happened. But she has family, she has a daughter, she has people who need to see her, and she need to be able to relax, chill, fall back, and not have the state on her and come and deal with her family, her grandkids, and all of that. And that's the work I'm trying to do. And I invite folks to join us this month, in that work, but also in the work of the Maroon initiatives. And the major one is our Maroons camp every summer, which basically does a from urban to rural, exchange. And that exchange is you from the hood, you see what's happening, you see the food is getting served, you see that the housing, you see all of those things. And we're here to support that. We're here to educate. We're here like Maroon would do, to give you what you need ideologically to try to move to the next level, to try to survive, to try to be sustained, to try to be healthy, to try to be loved, to try to be in community. And these things are learning processes, just like we explained today. They're all learning processes. It won't happen overnight. And so we need to start the processes now, and so you come up, we show you everything from just how to pitch a tent to how to turn food scraps into, compost and rich soil for you to grow whatever, you need to eat in, and how to grow those things and move, throughout the process. And so that's Homegrown Maroons initiative, but we also have Curb Fest. Curb Fest is an apparatus for political prisoners where it's a block party. You go in your hood and you organize. Curb Fest is about organizing. You go to your neighbors and you say, hey, we want to do a block party for the people, in the 60s who gave their lives for us to have liberation and freedom, and you educate them, and we'll give you the material. We'll send you a toolkit to work with your neighborhood. The major thing with organizing a block party or anything like that and going out into the streets, as we hadn't done since kind of George Floyd, or some people have went back to asking for permits from the state. And that's a concession that we had won from the state. The state had told you, you don't have to give us no money. You don't have to write no petitions and none of that. You ain't got to go and sign no paper down at City Hall in order to take over your block, in order to play music in the street, in order to march or rally, or you just show up. And people just were showing up, and the cops was backing up and saying, all right, y'all go ahead. And it got to the point with the George Floyd rebellion to where the state was asking people, what do y'all want us to do so y'all can just go home and get out of the streets? We'll paint Black Lives Matter in the street for you. We'll do this for you. We'll do that for you, whatever. No one was saying, give us our political prisoners. Nobody with the microphone, none of our big leaders, and it wasn't Sharpton this time. So we can't say that. We done moved past the Sharpton piece. We have other people who the state goes to. And like Hyrum said, it's more decentralized now, where the state got to look around too and be like, oh, we can't go to these people. We can't go to the NAACP because nobody, those type of residents have changed, or we can't go to these, or we can't go to Al because they don't resonate with Al, or whatever it may be. And so it's this kind of space where the state is like, we want them to stop and we want them to go home. Who do we go to? And the Dragon and Hydra, that's what we want. We want them to not have anyone to go to. We want to leverage the power onto our side. And then we want to be prepared, politically educated, to know what we're asking for. You may go back into indigenous studies. You can go to the 10-point program or the Panthers. You can go to women's rights. You can go to a bunch of scholars who have written about what are the things that are in negotiation during struggle and movement. A lot of times it's land, but do that research, do that homework, so that when we get the state in the most excellent moment, we don't ask for the wrong things.
Much appreciated, man. I do want to shout out. I'll pull up the Homegrown Maroons. I think I was able to find it here. Is this the website?
Yes. And we're working on a new one, but yes, that is the Homegrown Maroons. And cool. Again, we'll be putting out programming this summer. We take you out to the land and again give you all of the skill sets. That's maple syrup making, foraging, fishing, all of the different things, fire building, plant identification, farm tours. And we have a collective of farms up and down the East Coast. We have our own ecological underground railroad, and I'm putting that out on this platform only, so you will only hear that here. If you want to learn about the Underground Railroad, holla at us, the Maroon initiatives, and we'll put you on, we'll vet you and make sure you can get through the Underground Railroad.
Awesome. Much appreciated. I also want to just remind folks too of Free Kamal Siddiqui's campaign, who's another political prisoner that is still behind the walls. Also, I believe also associated with the liberation of Asada, right?
Yes, actually is has a child with Asada.
Right.
So
right.
yes, that is Asada's partner in birth. Some people would say baby daddy. But yes, good brother, staunch brother, transferred all of my dad's movement networks, contacts, best practices over to the Kamal Siddiqui campaign. So please join us in the Kamal Siddiqui campaign to liberate Kamal Siddiqui. But let's free them all. Let's liberate Imam Jamil. Let's liberate Mumia. Let's liberate Leonard. Let's free them all.
Absolutely. Much appreciated. Thank you so much. Do you want to share at all how people can connect with you if they want to get in touch?
Yes. I'm at rshoatz@gmail. That's RSHOATZ @gmail. rshoatz@gmail. You can also reach me through social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Instagram at Russell Shoatz III. We are at I Am Maroon on Instagram for the book, for shirts, for merchandise, for other writings of Maroon, for our Maroon initiative. All of that is also on Instagram, but also on the website. And join our programming, help us liberate more political prisoners, and help us get to a space where we can have solidarity and we can have some liberation for ourselves.
Awesome. Right on. Thank you so much for this, Russell. Thank you for
Thank you. I
also
appreciate you so much.
for bringing Hyrum through for this. I thought that was great. And shout out to Hyrum. I know he had to run, but always good to be in dialogue with him as well. And this is a really powerful conversation. And I definitely, again, absolutely recommend and encourage people go buy a copy of the book and read it for yourselves and be challenged by it, as I'm sure you will be. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, brother. Have a great one. I appreciate you.
You too. I appreciate you.